civil rights movement was an important moment in the United States history. African Americans took charge and changed the way society functioned. Without the brave few who stood for African American rights, their rights would be non-existent. The civil rights movement lasted several years and consisted of many different important people, events, and major changes in the United States government and society. Before the civil rights movement that began in the mid-1950s, there were a set of laws put into place after the ending of the Civil War. These laws were known as the Jim Crow laws and were passed over a span of several years that segregated African Americans from whites. The first of these laws were to be passed in Tennessee in 1881. This Jim Crow law segregated railroad cars. The next Jim Crow law is to be passed after the decision of the Plessy v. Ferguson case. This segregated public schools and made Jim Crow laws constitutional. Several more Jim Crow laws were to pass after these, resulting in more segregation from African Americans and whites. It was not until 1964, when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, that Jim Crow laws were abolished and named unconstitutional. The beginning of the Civil Rights Movement started in 1950. The Civil Rights Movement is an event in history that took place through 1954 and 1968. Before this event, segregation was a common thing in the United States. It meant that African Americans and white people had everything separate from each other. Separate neighborhoods, separate areas on buses, separate waterfalls, and even separate schools. The spark of this movement was the resistance of Rosa Parks showed was sitting on the white side of the bus. After this, African Americans all over the country took charge and demanded change. This demand of change took place in forms of speeches, marches across the country, and protests held by citizens. Through these events, many well-known activists emerged. Without the hope of these courageous activists, the rights of African Americans may have never been changed from what they are. One of the most important activists during the Civil Rights Movement was Martin Luther King Jr. In the book Martin Luther King Jr. by John A. Kirk, he states that Martin Luther King Jr. was a potent symbol in the movement of Black people. John A. Kirk also continues on to talk about the many different speeches that Martin Luther King Jr. gave. During the Civil Rights Movement, he gave speeches like "Give This a Ballot," "Our God is Being Marched On," and his most infamous speech, "I Have a Dream," all played a major role in showing the African Americans around the world that the movement was real. Another important activist that played an important role during the Civil Rights Movement was Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was often referred to as the mother of civil rights. She was arrested on December 1st, 1955, for refusing to sit on the black part of the bus. She did this because whites were allowed to sit on the front of the bus while blacks were forced to sit on the back. This started the Montgomery bus boycott, and 17,000 black citizens took place in. These two figures were some of the few that drove the ensuring issue of segregation. They pushed the movement's potential beyond anyone's wildest dream and helped thousands of Americans to believe in it. Another major event that took place during the Civil Rights Movement was the development of Freedom Riders. The Supreme Court decision in Morgan v. Virginia led to the desegregation of public buses. Freedom Riders were large supporters and enforcers of this decision. They used peaceful methods to show that desegregated buses were of no harm to society. Groups of blacks and whites would gather and take public buses across states as an example of the good the Supreme Court decision had done. These tests were rejected by many. If not for them, the road to all public buses being desegregated may have never paved. One of the major events that were talked about in the origins of the Civil Rights Movement by Alden D. Morris and the sit-ins and clusters of 1960. In this book, it states that these clusters of sit-ins happened in several different cities that were close to each other. During these sit-ins, Alden D. Morris talks about how people would boycott and refuse to do different things within different towns. This led to a decade of disruption. The passing of Martin Luther King Jr. brought a change to the United States government as well. After the outbreak of these riots, President Lyndon B. Johnson urged Americans to reject the blind violence. After King had died, whom they called the Apostle of Nonviolence. During this time, President Lyndon B. Johnson asked Congress to speed up the passing of the civil rights legislation. Congress finally acted on President Lyndon B. Johnson's request. The government passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This law, first proposed by President John F. Kennedy and was eventually signed into success by Lyndon B. Johnson. Under this new act, it banned segregation on the grounds of race, religion, and national religion at all public accommodations. This included courthouses, parks, restaurants, theaters, sports arenas, and hotels. After this law was put into place, blacks could no longer be denied service based on their color of his or her skin. The act was also created in the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. This gave people the power to file lawsuits on behalf of aggravated workers. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 has been a second in emancipation. Without the passing of this act, segregation would still be a part of everyday life, and African Americans would not be given the same rights and freedoms as whites were given. Throughout history, African Americans and minorities have had a hard fight for equal rights and freedom. The civil rights movement that began in the mid-1950s led to many different changes that let African Americans gain the rights and freedom. Many activists emerged from this movement that helped bring change to not only government, but society as a whole. Without the help from the many different activists, speeches, marches, and protests held by these people, these changes in society would have never been able to be accomplished.